there is a door. It is made of oak, darkened not by stain but by time. 330 years of coastal Massachusetts air pressing into its grain until the wood turned the color of something that has been held underwater and brought back. The door hangs on hand-forged iron hinges. The latch is original. The threshold beneath it has been worn into a shallow valley by the weight of every foot that has crossed it since 1675, which means the stone remembers more than any living person possibly could. This door belongs to a house at 310.5 Essex Street in Salem, Massachusetts. It is the only standing structure in the city with verified direct ties to the witch trials of 1692. It is called the Witch House, and for more than 3 centuries, people have walked through that door, stood inside its rooms, and felt something they could not entirely explain: a density in the air, a reluctance in the walls, a sensation that the house is not merely old but actively inhabited by its own history. The question the building raises is not whether witchcraft is real. The question is narrower than that and far more difficult. Why does this particular house, among all the houses that stood in Salem in 1692, remain? Why did the others fall, burn, or get torn down while this one endured? And is it possible that a building can absorb enough collective fear, enough accusation, enough proximity to death, that the absorption itself becomes indistinguishable from a curse? Before the house became a symbol, it was simply a home. It was built sometime between 1620 and 1642. The exact date is disputed among architectural historians, though the most widely accepted estimate places initial construction around 1635. The structure is a first-period colonial, meaning it was built during the earliest decades of English settlement in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Its frame is post and beam. Its walls are clapboard over heavy timber. The rooms are small, the ceilings low, the windows narrow in the way that windows were narrow when glass was expensive and winter was an adversary that entered through every opening. The house was not unusual for its time. Dozens of similar structures once lined the streets of Salem. What made this one different was not its construction, it was its occupant. The house was the home of Jonathan Corwin. He was born in 1640, the son of Captain George Corwin, one of the wealthiest men in Salem. Jonathan inherited both the house and his father's social position. He became a merchant, a landowner, a selectman, and eventually a magistrate, a local judicial official empowered to conduct preliminary examinations in criminal cases. He was, by the standards of his time and place, respectable, prosperous, and embedded in the civic machinery of colonial Salem. He lived in the house with his wife, Elizabeth, and their children. He hosted meetings there. He conducted business from its front rooms. He walked through that oak door every day of his adult life. And in 1692, when the accusations began, when the girls in Salem Village started naming names and the magistrates were called upon to examine the accused, Jonathan Corwin became one of the judges. The examinations he conducted did not take place in the house. They were held at the Salem Village Meeting House and later at other public venues. But the accused were sometimes brought to Corwin's home before or after their hearings. Witnesses came and went through that door. Legal documents were drafted in those rooms. Decisions that would lead to imprisonment, trial, and execution were discussed within those walls. The house did not witness the hangings, but it participated in the architecture of judgment that made them possible. To understand what happened in Salem in 1692, and why the residue of it still clings to this house, you have to understand the town that produced it. Salem in the late 17th century was not a single community. It was two. Salem town, the coastal settlement, was mercantile, relatively prosperous, and oriented toward the Atlantic trade. Salem Village, a few miles inland, was agricultural, poorer, and increasingly resentful of the economic and political dominance of the town. The two were legally and spiritually entangled. Salem Village's residents paid taxes to Salem town, attended its courts, and depended on its harbor. But the relationship was marked by friction that had been building for decades. Land disputes, boundary arguments, competing claims to political representation, and deep disagreements about ministerial authority had created a community that was, by 1692, fractured along lines of class, geography, and religious interpretation. This fracture is essential. The witch trials did not emerge from a stable community suddenly gripped by hysteria. They emerged from a community that was already breaking, and the accusations followed the fault lines. The first accusations came in January of 1692. Betty Paris, the 9-year-old daughter of Salem Village's minister, and her cousin Abigail Williams, age 11, began exhibiting what observers described as fits, convulsions, screaming, contorted postures, episodes in which they appeared to be struck by invisible forces. A local physician, unable to identify a physical cause, suggested the affliction might be supernatural. Under pressure to name the source of their torment, the girls identified 3 women: Tituba, an enslaved woman in the Paris household; Sarah Good, a homeless woman known for her sharp tongue; and Sarah Osborne, an elderly woman who had not attended church in over a year. The 3 were arrested on February 29, 1692. Their examinations were conducted by Jonathan Corwin and his fellow magistrate John Hathorne. These examinations were not trials. They were preliminary hearings, designed to determine whether sufficient evidence existed to hold the accused for trial. But they were conducted with a presumption of guilt that would shape everything that followed. The magistrates did not ask the accused whether they had practiced witchcraft. They asked them why they had practiced witchcraft. The question contained its own answer. Tituba, under examination, confessed. Her confession was elaborate, detailed, and almost certainly coerced. She described flying on sticks, meeting a tall man in black, signing a book, and seeing the specters of the other accused women tormenting the children. Historians have debated for centuries whether Tituba's confession was a survival strategy, a product of cultural translation, a response to physical intimidation, or some combination of all 3. What is not debated is its effect. Her confession confirmed, in the minds of the magistrates and the community, that the threat was real. If one accused witch confessed, the others must be guilty. And if 3 witches existed in Salem, there might be more. The logic of the accusation demanded expansion. Fear, once validated, does not contract. It spreads. What made the Salem proceedings particularly unstable, and what connects them, across centuries, to the house where they were partially administered was the doctrine of spectral evidence. This was the legal principle that allowed the afflicted to testify not about what the accused had physically done, but about what the accused's specter had done to them in visions. A girl could stand in the meeting house and claim that the invisible shape of the accused was, at that very moment, pinching her, biting her, sitting on her chest. The accused, standing across the room in full view, could offer no defense against a claim about their invisible double. The logic was closed. Denial was irrelevant. The specter operated independently of the body, and the body was held accountable for the specter's actions. This meant that the courtroom itself became a theater of affliction. The girls' fits, their screams, their contortions, their claims to see shapes and figures that no one else could perceive, were not merely symptoms. They were evidence. And the evidence was unfalsifiable because it existed entirely within the subjective experience of the afflicted. No one could prove the specter was not there, and in a community that already believed in the active intervention of the devil in human affairs, no one was culturally equipped to argue that specters were not admissible. The ministers debated it. Cotton Mather, the influential Boston clergyman, cautioned against over-reliance on spectral evidence even as he supported the trials more broadly. Increase Mather, his father, would eventually argue that it was better for 10 suspected witches to escape than for one innocent person to suffer, a formulation that acknowledged the problem without quite stopping the machine. But in the rooms where examinations were conducted, in the meeting house and in the magistrate's home, spectral evidence flowed freely, and the people who received it, Jonathan Corwin among them, allowed it to shape their decisions. The house on Essex Street was not merely a residence adjacent to a legal proceeding. It was a node in a system that had abandoned the distinction between testimony and hallucination, between law and belief, between what could be observed and what could only be felt. The system's collapse, when it came, would not be a correction. It would be an exhaustion. And spread it did. Through March, April, May, and June of 1692, the accusations multiplied. The afflicted girls, whose number grew to include several other young women, named more and more people. The accused were no longer marginal figures. They included Martha Corey, a respected church member. They included Rebecca Nurse, an elderly woman widely regarded as pious and gentle. They included a former minister. They included a former year-old child. The pattern of accusation shifted from the socially vulnerable to the socially inconvenient, people whose land was coveted, whose family connections were resented, whose independence was threatening, whose very respectability made their supposed guilt more alarming and therefore more useful to those who benefited from the atmosphere of suspicion. Jonathan Corwin examined many of these accused. He sat in judgment in rooms that would later be dismantled, rebuilt, or torn down. But his house remained. And the house, over the centuries, would become the physical anchor for a memory that Salem itself spent generations trying to suppress, rewrite, and ultimately monetize. By mid-1692, the jails were full. More than 100 people had been accused. A special court, the Court of Oyer and Terminer, was established to try the cases. Between June and September, 19 people were hanged on Proctor's Ledge, a small rise near Salem. One man, Giles Corey, was pressed to death under heavy stones when he refused to enter a plea. A method of execution so unusual and so brutal that it became, in the centuries that followed, one of the most frequently cited details of the trials, a fact so extreme that it functions almost as a seal on the case, a detail that resists integration into any narrative that attempts to rationalize what happened. Several more accused died in jail, and then, as suddenly as the crisis had begun, it stopped. By October, Governor William Phips dissolved the Court of Oyer and Terminer. By the following year, the remaining accused were released. The colony entered a period of public reckoning that would take decades to complete. Public fasts, formal apologies, financial restitution to the families of the executed. In 1711, the colonial legislature passed an act restoring the good names of some of the accused. In 1957, 265 years later, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts formally apologized. The timeline of that apology tells its own story about the speed at which institutions process guilt. Jonathan Corwin lived until 1718. He was 78 years old. He never publicly expressed regret for his role in the trials. This silence is significant because it was not universal among those who participated. In 1697, Judge Samuel Sewall, who had served on the Court of Oyer and Terminer that condemned the accused to death, stood in his church pew while his minister read aloud a statement of repentance that Sewall had written. In the statement, Sewall asked forgiveness from God and from the people of the colony for his role in the executions. He acknowledged that innocent blood had been shed. He took personal responsibility. He observed a day of fasting and humiliation every year for the rest of his life. Sewall's repentance is one of the earliest and most dramatic examples of individual accountability in American public life. It is cited in nearly every history of the trials. It is admired, cautiously, as an act of moral courage, and it throws into sharp relief the silence of those who did not follow his example. Jonathan Corwin said nothing. John Hathorne, his fellow magistrate, said nothing. Neither man recanted. Neither man fasted. Neither man stood in a church and asked to be forgiven. Whether their silence reflected defiance, denial, shame, or simply the belief that they had acted correctly is not recorded. But the silence is there, embedded in the historical record, like a gap in a floorboard. And the house that Corwin inhabited for the remainder of his long life absorbed that silence the way old wood absorbs humidity, slowly, completely, without visible change. The house passed to his descendants and then to subsequent owners, each of whom altered the structure in ways that reflected their era. Additions, renovations, reconfigurations that slowly obscured the original architecture. By the 19th century, the house had been modified so extensively that its first period origins were no longer immediately apparent. It had become, in physical terms, a palimpsest, each generation riding over the previous one, each renovation burying the bones of the original structure a little deeper. The house might have been lost entirely, demolished to make way for a pharmacy or a parking lot, as so many colonial structures were. In 1856, it was nearly torn down when Essex Street was widened. A local druggist who owned the property at the time considered demolition more profitable than preservation. Public sentiment, still ambivalent about the trials and about drawing attention to them, offered little resistance. The house survived not because Salem valued it, but because the economics of demolition in that particular year did not quite justify the expense. Survival by indifference. It is a pattern that repeats in the history of preservation. The buildings that endure are not always the ones a community chooses to save. Sometimes they are simply the ones it fails to destroy. But in 1944, the city of Salem purchased the property and undertook a restoration. The later additions were stripped away. The original structure was revealed. And what the restoration uncovered was, in its way, as revealing as any testimony from 1692. Beneath the 19th century plaster, workers found the original wall surfaces, still bearing the marks of 17th century tools. Beneath the later flooring, they found the original wide pine boards, worn but intact. In the walls, they found fragments of earlier construction. Hand-split lath, horsehair plaster, wooden pegs that had held the frame together for nearly 300 years. The house, stripped of its disguises, looked almost exactly as it had when Jonathan Corwin walked its rooms. The restoration did not merely reveal architecture. It revealed continuity. The same timbers that had stood while the accused were examined were still standing. The same floor that had borne the weight of magistrates and prisoners was still bearing weight. The house had been covered, modified, made unrecognizable, but it had not been changed. Underneath everything, the original structure had waited, patient and intact, for someone to uncover it. And the house was opened to the public as a museum under the name by which it is now known, the Witch House. This is the point where two histories diverge. One is the history of the house as a preserved colonial structure, a museum of 17th century domestic life, maintained by the city and staffed by guides who explain hearth cooking methods, period furniture, and the legal mechanics of the witch trials. This history is educational, measured, and deliberately prosaic. It treats the house as an artifact. The other history is the one that visitors bring with them and, sometimes, take away. It is the history of the house as a place that is not entirely finished with what happened inside it. A place that holds something it has not been able to release. The reports began, or at least were first documented, not long after the house opened as a museum. Staff members described small irregularities, doors that opened when no one was near them, cold spots in rooms where the heating was functioning normally, the sound of footsteps on the second floor during hours when the building was empty. These early reports were not dramatic. They were domestic in scale, as though the disturbance, if it was a disturbance, operated according to the same modesty as the house itself. A guide in the 1960s described the sensation of being watched while standing in the rear bedroom. Not the feeling of a hostile presence, but of an attentive one, as though someone were standing just outside the frame of her peripheral vision, observing without intervening. Another staff member, working alone in the building during a winter evening in the 1970s, reported hearing what sounded like quiet conversation coming from the keeping room. Not distinct words, but the cadence and rhythm of speech, as though two people were discussing something just below the threshold of comprehension. When she entered the room, it was empty. The sound did not resume. These accounts are individually unremarkable. Old buildings make sounds, drafts move doors, cold spots occur in structures with inconsistent insulation and 3 centuries of settling. The human auditory system, in silence, will generate its own content, a phenomenon well documented in psychoacoustic research, and the feeling of being watched. particularly in a space associated with suffering and death, is a common psychological response, not a paranormal event. But the reports did not stop. They continued through the decades, accumulating with the particular patience of things that are not urgent but will not be dismissed. By the 1990s, the witch house had become a regular site for paranormal investigators. The investigations were conducted with varying degrees of rigor. Some groups brought electromagnetic field detectors, infrared cameras, digital audio recorders, and other equipment that had become standard in the field. Others brought little more than enthusiasm and a willingness to interpret ambiguity as evidence. The results, predictably, were mixed. EMF readings fluctuated in certain rooms, which investigators attributed to spectral presence and which skeptics attributed to the old wiring. Photographs occasionally showed orbs, small, circular anomalies that appear in images taken in dusty or humid environments and that have been exhaustively debunked as artifacts of particulate matter near the camera lens. Audio recordings captured sounds that some listeners interpreted as voices, and others interpreted as the building settling, traffic outside, or the recorder's own mechanical noise. But among the noise, both literal and interpretive, certain patterns recurred. Investigators from different groups, visiting at different times without knowledge of each other's findings, reported similar experiences in the same locations within the house. The rear bedroom on the second floor generated the most consistent responses. Feelings of heaviness, sudden temperature changes, and what multiple investigators independently describe as a sense of pressure, as though the air in the room had thickened. The keeping room on the first floor, where Corwin is believed to have conducted some of his judicial work, produced audio anomalies with greater frequency than other rooms. And the staircase, the narrow turning staircase that connects the first and second floors, was repeatedly described as a space where visitors felt reluctance, not fear, but the physical sensation of not wanting to continue upward, as though the house were gently discouraging ascent. The consistency of these reports does not constitute proof of anything supernatural. Consistency can be produced by suggestion as easily as by genuine phenomena. Once a location develops a reputation for specific experiences, visitors arrive primed to have those experiences. The rear bedroom is described as active, so visitors enter it with heightened alertness, and heightened alertness produces sensations that confirm the description. This is not deception. It is not even delusion. It is the ordinary operation of a mind that has been given a narrative and is looking for evidence to inhabit it. The question is whether the narrative preceded the experience, or whether the experience preceded the narrative and the narrative simply organized what was already being felt. There is a detail about the house that complicates the standard debunking. In 2004, a historian named Marilyn Roach, who had spent decades researching the Salem trials, published a comprehensive account that included new information about the Corwin house's role in the proceedings. Roach's research confirmed what had been suspected but not definitively established, that at least some of the accused were held, temporarily, in the house itself before being transported to jail. The house was not merely where a judge lived. It was, for some of the accused, the first space of their confinement. They entered through that oak door not as visitors, but as prisoners. They waited in rooms that were simultaneously domestic and carceral. They sat in chairs that belonged to the man who would decide whether they lived or died. The intimacy of this arrangement, judgment conducted in a home the accused held in a parlor, is difficult to process from a modern perspective. It collapses the distance between the legal and the personal in a way that feels almost obscene. And it means that the house's connection to the trials is not abstract, it is physical. The accused were there. Their bodies occupied those rooms. Their fear was present in that space. And whether or not fear leaves a residue that can be detected 3 centuries later, the knowledge that it was there changes the experience of standing in those rooms in a way that cannot be unfelt. This is where the case of the Salem Witch House begins to shift, from a question about ghosts to a question about what buildings hold. Not literally. Not in the way that paranormal investigators mean when they talk about residual energy or stone tape theory, or any of the other frameworks that attempt to give physical mechanism to the intuition that places remember, but functionally. The house holds, in its dimensions, its materials, its layout, and its history, an emotional charge that visitors respond to whether or not they believe in the supernatural. The low ceilings press down. The narrow windows restrict light. The small rooms enforce proximity. The stairs turn in a way that conceals what lies above. The architecture itself, designed for a 17th-century family, produces in modern visitors a physical experience of confinement that echoes with uncomfortable precision the experience of the people who were once confined there against their will. The house does not need to be haunted to feel haunted. Its construction and its history collaborate to produce the same effect. But there is another layer. Because the house is not just a colonial artifact. It is a colonial artifact located in Salem, Massachusetts, a city that has spent 3 centuries negotiating its relationship to a trauma that made it famous. And that negotiation has shaped the house's meaning in ways that have nothing to do with what may or may not move through its rooms at night. Salem's relationship to the witch trials has passed through several distinct phases, each of which has altered the cultural function of the witch house. The first phase was silence. For most of the 18th and early 19th centuries, the trials were a source of shame. Families of the judges distanced themselves from their ancestors' roles. The trials were discussed, when they were discussed at all, as an aberration, a moment of collective madness that the community had long since transcended. The Corwin house, during this period, was simply a house. Its association with the trials was known locally but not emphasized. It was inherited, sold, modified, and lived in without ceremony. The second phase began in the mid-19th century, when the trials became a subject of literary and historical interest. Nathaniel Hawthorne, himself a descendant of Judge John Hathorne, Jonathan Corwin's fellow magistrate, explored the psychological legacy of the trials in his fiction, most notably in The House of the Seven Gables, published in 1851. That novel, which describes a family cursed by their ancestors' role in the persecution of an accused witch, introduced a narrative framework that would prove remarkably durable. The idea that the violence of 1692 had not ended with the hangings, but had continued to operate through time, passing from generation to generation as a kind of inherited stain. Hawthorne's novel is fiction, but its emotional logic, that guilt does not dissolve, that places absorb the moral weight of what occurs within them, that a curse is simply a consequence that refuses to expire, became the lens through which many people understood Salem's history. The witch house was not the model for Hawthorne's fictional house, but the two became entangled in the public imagination, and the entanglement reinforced the idea that the Corwin house carried something forward from 1692, something that architecture preserved and time could not dilute. The third phase, the one Salem currently inhabits, began in the late 20th century and accelerated into the 21st. It is the phase of commercialization. Salem has become, in the bluntest terms, a witch city. The trials are its brand. Every October, the population of the city swells with tourists who come for haunted happenings, the month-long festival that transforms Salem into a carnival of the macabre, psychic readings, haunted houses, ghost tours, witch-themed merchandise, costume parades, and an atmosphere of performative spookiness that bears almost no relationship to the Puritan terror of 1692. The witch house sits inside this economy. It is, by some measures, its most legitimate artifact, the one place in Salem where the tourist spectacle makes contact with an actual historical surface. And this creates a tension that the house absorbs without resolving. Visitors arrive carrying two incompatible expectations. They expect a museum, and they expect to feel something. The museum gives them context. The feeling, if it comes, gives them confirmation that the history is not merely past, that it is still present, still active, still, in some unspecifiable way, unfinished. The commercialization of Salem's trauma has been criticized extensively, and the criticism is warranted. There is something genuinely troubling about a city that profits from the memory of 20 people who were killed by their neighbors on fabricated evidence. The executed were not witches. They were not even accused of real crimes, by any standard that a modern legal system would recognize. They were victims of a judicial process that accepted spectral evidence. The testimony of accusers who claim to see the specter of the accused tormenting them in visions, as grounds for conviction. They were killed because a community in crisis needed to externalize its fear, and the externalization required bodies. To convert that history into entertainment is, at minimum, to participate in a second erasure. The erasure of the victim's suffering behind a mask of commercial novelty. And the witch house, as the sole surviving structure directly tied to the trials, becomes the site where this erasure is both most visible and most contested. It is a museum that tells the truth. It is also a stop on a ghost tour. The two functions exist simultaneously within the same walls, and neither cancels the other. But criticism of Salem's commercialism, while necessary, does not fully explain why people feel what they feel inside the witch house. The commercial context primes visitors, certainly. It tells them to expect the uncanny. It gives them a vocabulary of haunting before they cross the threshold. But priming alone does not account for the specificity of the reports, the consistency of the locations within the house that generate responses, the similarity of descriptions offered by visitors who arrive with different levels of belief and different degrees of exposure to Salem's marketing. Something in the house produces a response that is not entirely explained by suggestion. The question is what? One possibility is architectural. The witch house is a first-period structure, and first-period architecture operates on the human nervous system in ways that modern architecture does not. The ceilings are roughly 6 feet high in most rooms. For the majority of adult visitors, this means standing with the ceiling at or near the crown of the head. The effect is subconscious but powerful. A persistent, low-grade sense of compression that the body registers as confinement, even when the mind understands that the ceiling height is simply a feature of 17th-century construction. The windows are small, admitting limited light, so the interior exists in a state of permanent dimness that contemporary eyes accustomed to large windows and electric illumination interpret as concealment. The rooms open into one another without hallways, creating a spatial experience in which privacy is impossible, and every room is a passage to another room. The stairs are narrow and turning, which means that each step upward carries the visitor deeper into a space they cannot see in advance. These are not symbolic features. They are physical ones. They act on the body directly, producing sensations, compression, dimness, exposure, disorientation, that the mind then interprets through whatever framework is available. For a visitor who believes in ghosts, the framework is paranormal. For a visitor who does not, the framework is historical unease. Either way, the sensation is real. The architecture generates it. The history gives it meaning. Another possibility is contextual. The witch house does not exist in isolation. It exists within a city saturated with references to death, persecution, and the supernatural. A visitor who enters the house has almost certainly walked past witch-themed shops, seen theatrical representations of the trials, and absorbs through signs, advertisements, and conversation the message that Salem is a place where the boundary between the living and the dead is unusually thin. This saturation creates a psychological environment in which anomalous experiences are not only possible but expected. The visitor arrives already believing not necessarily in ghosts, but in the possibility that this particular place might produce an experience that feels like contact with something beyond the ordinary. And expectation, in the psychology of perception, is one of the most powerful determinants of experience. We do not perceive the world neutrally. We perceive it through the filter of what we anticipate. And in a house where we anticipate the uncanny, the creak of an old floorboard becomes a footstep. The draft from a poorly sealed window becomes a cold spot, and the ordinary silence of an empty room becomes a silence that is listening. You might, at this point, find the rational account persuasive. Architecture, psychology, suggestion, and the commercial machinery of Salem's tourist economy, together, these explanations account for a great deal. They explain why the house produces reactions. They explain why those reactions cluster in specific locations. They explain why the reports are consistent in their general character, even as they vary in their specific details. They explain the witch house without requiring anything beyond the interaction of an old building, a heavy history, and a human nervous system calibrated to detect threats and patterns even when none are present. And yet, if you have stood in the rear bedroom of the witch house, stood there quietly without a guide, without a group, without the protective noise of other visitors, you may have felt something that the rational account does not quite reach. Not a ghost, not a presence, but an attention. A quality of silence that feels occupied, a sense that the room is not empty but full of something that has no form, no sound, and no mechanism, but that registers nonetheless as real. You might call it atmosphere. You might call it history. You might call it the accumulated weight of 3 centuries of people standing in the same space and feeling the same thing. Whatever you call it, it is there. And the rational explanation, thorough as it is, does not make it go away. It simply gives it a different name. There is a detail about the Corwin family that most visitors to the witch house never learn, and that shifts the frame of the entire story when you encounter it. Jonathan Corwin was not the only member of his family involved in the trials. His nephew, George Corwin, served as the High Sheriff of Essex County, the official responsible for carrying out the executions. It was George Corwin who oversaw the hangings on Proctor's Ledge. It was George Corwin who, according to historical accounts, seized the property of the accused and convicted, a practice that was technically legal but widely regarded as corrupt and that enriched him personally. And it was George Corwin who, according to a persistent local tradition, was so feared and despised by the time of his death in 1696 that his family buried him in the basement of their home rather than risk the desecration of his grave by townspeople who had not forgiven his role in the executions. This account, the sheriff buried beneath his own floor, has been repeated for centuries. Its veracity is difficult to confirm. Some historians accept it as likely. Others regard it as an embellishment that crystallized around a genuine core of public anger. But whether or not George Corwin was literally buried in a basement, the story itself is significant. It tells us that the community's response to the trials did not end with the official apologies and the legislative acts of restitution. It continued as a private, persistent hostility that followed the families of the judges and executioners for generations. The curse, if there was a curse, was not supernatural. It was social. It was the weight of a community's unprocessed guilt, redirected as blame toward the individuals who had carried out the community's own collective decision. The judges did not act alone. The accusations came from the community. The testimony came from neighbors. The verdicts were delivered by juries of local men. But when the reckoning came, it was the judges and the sheriff who bore the burden. They became, in effect, the community's sacrifice, the figures onto whom collective guilt could be projected, so that the collective itself could be absolved. This pattern, the projection of communal guilt onto specific individuals and, by extension, onto their property, is the psychological mechanism that may explain the persistent sense that the witch house is cursed. A curse, in the folk understanding, is a punishment that attaches to a person, a family, or a place because of a transgression. It is justice that operates outside the legal system, persisting across generations, refusing the statute of limitations that human law imposes. But a curse is also, in psychological terms, a narrative strategy for managing guilt. If the house is cursed, then the suffering it contains is contained, localized, bounded, attached to a specific structure and a specific family. It does not spread. It does not implicate the broader community that participated in the trials, benefited from the seizure of the accused's property, or simply stood by while their neighbors were killed. The curse makes the witch house a container for guilt that would otherwise have no home, and as long as the house stands, the guilt has an address. It can be visited, it can be observed, it can be felt, genuinely, physically felt, by people who walk through the door and sense, without quite understanding, that they are standing inside something unresolved. Consider for a moment the accused themselves, not as symbols, not as names on a memorial, but as specific people who stood in specific rooms and heard specific questions that they could not answer correctly because no correct answer existed. Rebecca Nurse was 71 years old when she was examined. She was nearly deaf. She had difficulty following the questions put to her. When the afflicted girls cried out during her examination, claiming her specter was tormenting them, she could not hear their accusations clearly enough to respond. Her silence, the silence of an elderly woman struggling to comprehend a proceeding designed to destroy her, was interpreted as guilt. She was convicted, then briefly reprieved, when the jury returned a not guilty verdict. The court sent the jury back. They reconvened. They changed their verdict to guilty. She was hanged on July 19, 1692. Her family retrieved her body and buried her secretly on their property, because the executed were denied consecrated burial. 3 centuries later, visitors to the witch house stand in rooms where Rebecca Nurse's fate was discussed, where the legal machinery that converted her deafness into evidence of witchcraft was maintained, and they feel something they describe as sadness, or heaviness, or the presence of someone who should not still be there. Whether that feeling is a ghost or conscience is a question the house does not answer. It simply holds the space where the question forms. The Corwin family's fortunes after 1692 offer an oblique commentary on the concept of a familial curse. Jonathan Corwin himself lived a long life and died prosperous. His descendants continued to hold positions of prominence in Salem for several generations. There is no dramatic pattern of misfortune, no cascade of untimely deaths, no visible mechanism of supernatural retribution. If the house was cursed, the curse was patient to the point of being imperceptible. What did happen, slowly, across centuries, was the erosion of the family's connection to the house and the transfer of the house's meaning from private residence to public symbol. The Corwins did not lose the house to calamity. They lost it to history. The house outlived their relevance to it. It became, over time, more important for what it represented than for who had lived in it. And this transfer, from family home to cultural artifact, is itself a kind of haunting. The Corwins are gone. Their furniture has been replaced by period reproductions. Their personal effects have dispersed into collections in private hands. But their name is on the door, and the door still opens, and the visitors who enter are not there to learn about the Corwins. They are there to feel the weight of what the Corwins participated in. The family has been reduced to its function in a narrative they cannot control. In that sense, the house has consumed them, not through supernatural predation, but through the ordinary, relentless appetite of public memory. The question the title asks, was it actually cursed, is, in the end, the wrong question. Or rather, it is a question that can only be answered by redefining what a curse is. If a curse is a supernatural force that punishes the guilty across generations, then no. The witch house is not cursed. There is no evidence of spectral punishment, no documented pattern of inexplicable misfortune attached to the property or its owners, no mechanism by which the suffering of the accused could be converted into an active, ongoing force directed at the structure that housed their judge. But if a curse is something else, if a curse is the condition of being unable to escape the consequences of an act, of being permanently defined by a moment of collective violence, of becoming a symbol that outlives every attempt to reduce it to mere architecture, then the house is cursed in exactly the way that matters. It cannot be just a house. It cannot be just a museum. It cannot be just a stop on a ghost tour. It is all of these things, and none of them. It is a door that people walk through expecting to find the past, and what they find instead is the present, their own need to feel something, to make contact with something, to stand inside a room where terrible decisions were made and confirm, through the evidence of their own nervous system, that those decisions left a mark. Salem knows this. The city has built an economy on it. Every October, the streets fill with people dressed as witches, vampires, and ghouls, costumes that have nothing to do with the Puritan farmers and merchants who were actually accused and killed. The disconnect is so vast that it functions as its own kind of evidence. The real history is unbearable, so the culture replaces it with a performance. The performance is entertaining, so it generates revenue. The revenue sustains the city, so the performance continues. And at the center of the performance, unchanged, unrenovated, unperforming, sits the witch house. It does not participate in the carnival. It simply endures it. The guides inside tell the real story. The rooms remain dim. The ceilings remain low. The door remains heavy. And the visitors who pause long enough to stop performing their own enthusiasm and actually stand in the silence of the rear bedroom sometimes report, quietly, reluctantly, that they felt something they did not expect, something that was not in the brochure, something the architecture and the history and the weight of 300 years of unresolved collective guilt pressed into them like a thumbprint in wet clay. The memorial to the victims of the witch trials is not at the witch house. It is located nearby, at the Salem Witch Trials Memorial, a quiet space designed by architect James Cutler and dedicated in 1992 on the 300th anniversary of the executions. The memorial consists of 20 stone benches, each inscribed with the name of one of the executed, their method of death, and the date. The benches are set into a low stone wall, and the inscriptions are deliberately cut off by the wall's edge, the victims' protests of innocence literally interrupted by stone, a design choice that makes the memorial's point with a precision that language alone could not achieve. The memorial is solemn and effective. It names the dead. It acknowledges the injustice. It provides a space for the kind of reflective grief that the witch house, with its complicated dual function as museum and attraction, cannot fully accommodate. But the memorial is visited during the day, photographed, and left. The witch house is entered. The difference matters. A memorial is observed from outside. A house is inhabited from within. When you step inside the witch house, you are not observing history. You are occupying the same space that history occupied. You are breathing the air that passes through the same window frames. You are standing on the same floorboards, worn into the same valleys by the same centuries of weight. The memorial tells you what happened. The house makes you feel where it happened. And feeling, in cases like this, is more persistent than knowing. You can forget a fact. You cannot easily forget a sensation. The witch house will continue to stand. It is maintained by the city. It is visited by hundreds of thousands of people each year. It will be repaired, preserved, and interpreted for future generations who will bring their own frameworks, their own needs, their own definitions of what it means for a place to be cursed. The house does not change. The people who enter it change, and the experience they report, the heaviness, the attention, the quality of silence that feels occupied, will continue to be generated, not by any force within the walls, but by the intersection of architecture, history, and the human need to feel that suffering does not simply vanish when the sufferers are gone, that it persists, that it adheres, that it waits in rooms that have not been altered for someone to walk in and recognize it. Some places become evidence before they become stories. The witch house is the opposite. It became a story first. It became the story of a curse, a haunting, a place where the past refuses to release its grip on the present. And then, when you strip the story away, when you remove the ghosts, the orbs, the EVP recordings, the commercial performances, the costumes, the candy, the spectacle, what remains is something quieter and more unsettling than any ghost. What remains is a house where a man sat in judgment over his neighbors, where the accused waited for a verdict that had already been decided, where the architecture of ordinary domestic life was converted, temporarily and irreversibly, into the architecture of persecution. What remains is the fact that 20 people died because a community could not tolerate its own uncertainty, its own internal fractures, its own fear of forces it could not control, and so it found people to blame and called the blame justice. What remains is the knowledge that the community then spent 3 centuries trying to decide what to do with what it had done, suppressing it, fictionalizing it, commercializing it, memorializing it, and ultimately transforming it into an industry that feeds on the very guilt it was supposed to resolve. What remains is the house. There is a door. It is made of oak, darkened by 330 years of air and weather and the particular chemical patience of time working on wood. The latch is original. The threshold is worn. The hinges are hand-forged iron. and they move the way hand-forged iron moves after centuries, slowly, with resistance, as though the door remembers every opening and has begun to grow reluctant. Beyond it, the rooms are small. The ceilings are low. The windows admit just enough light to see by, and not enough to see clearly. The house holds what it has always held, the dimensions of a life that became the dimensions of a judgment, and the judgment became a death, and the death became a silence, and the silence became a story, and the story became a city's identity, and the identity became a question that the house, standing at the center of all of it, continues to ask without speaking. Was it cursed? Stand inside long enough. Feel the ceiling settle toward you. Listen to the silence that is not quite silence. And notice that the question, like the door, answers itself by the weight of its own closing.